Welcome to this episode of our podcast on Monarchy in Peril. I'm Robert Aldrich, Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Sydney.
And I'm Cindy McCreary, an Associate Professor of History at the University of Sydney and Director of the Modern Monarchy in Global Perspective Research Hub.
The theme of this podcast is assassination. The killing of a monarch, what is technically often called regicide, has indeed occurred on a number of occasions in world history. Since antiquity, monarchs have been poisoned, stabbed, shot, even starved to death. Some have been quietly and secretly dispatched. Others have been done away with in very public and bloody spectacles. Yet others have survived attempts to kill them. Such incidents have been the stuff of history and also of drama. Think of the princes in the Tower in Britain, or of Hamlet's father. Well, Cindy, who have been some of the monarchs assassinated in recent times?
Well, the list is in fact a rather long one, and indeed a who's who of some of the major dynasties around the world. They include, for example, Tsar Alexander II of Russia in 1881, King Umberto I of Italy in 1900, King Alexander I of Serbia and Queen Draga 3 years later, King Carlos I of Portugal and Prince Royal Luis in 1908, and King George of Greece in 1913. And that just covers the ones before the start of the First World War. The outbreak of that war, of course, was precipitated by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, in Sarajevo in 1914.
Several royals in the Habsburg dynasty of Austria and Hungary were assassinated, weren't they?
Indeed so. One of the most famous was the Empress of Austria, Elizabeth, who was usually known as Sissi. Sissi was born into a German royal family, the Bavarian royal family, and she married Emperor Franz Joseph in 1854 at the tender age of 16. This made her a member of one of Europe's grandest royal families, the Habsburgs. But getting used to life in Vienna was difficult for her. She was tall, beautiful, and elegant, and she became very popular. Indeed, she was a real celebrity, one of the most famous women of her time who was adored by her emperor. But she did find court life very restrictive, and indeed in later life she spent much of her time beyond Vienna and indeed away from her husband. She enjoyed travel and traveled to Greece and Turkey, Morocco and Algeria. In 1898, at the age of 60, she went for a holiday to Switzerland. She was traveling incognito, but in fact her identity was an open secret and was revealed in a newspaper. As she and her lady-in-waiting were walking along the promenade on the shores of Lake Geneva, an unknown man came up to Sissi and stabbed her. She died of that wound.
Who was the assassin and why did he kill her?
Well, it turned out that the assassin had actually intended a different victim. His original target was the pretender to the Orleanist throne of France, whose throne had actually been abolished in 1848. But when the assassin found out that this Frenchman had left Geneva, he decided to attack Sissi instead. Now, he was an Italian and he was an anarchist. And by that we mean someone who believed that government, and particularly monarchical government, was terribly damaging and dangerous. And he testified, quote, "I am an anarchist by conviction. I came to Geneva to kill a sovereign, with the object of giving an example to those who suffer and those who do nothing to improve their social position. It did not matter to me who the sovereign was whom I should kill. It was not a woman I struck, but an empress. It was a crown that I had in view." So the assassination of Sissi, was it a political act?
Well, yes, although in this case it was the act of an individual acting alone rather than a planned assassination by a political group. But at the end of the 1800s and in the first years of the 20th century, there were a number of assassinations of political figures, including monarchs and presidents and prime ministers. Often these were committed by anarchists. Now, there were many dissident groups in Europe. Republicans and socialists generally opposed the monarchy, but they didn't promote the killing of royals. Anarchists were sometimes a bit different, and some of them thought that killing royals was appropriate. And throughout the anarchist group and even in wider society, there was a certain opposition to monarchs and to the inequalities in society that monarchs represented. For some of the anarchists, terror, that is the killing of a monarch or other royal figure or public personality, was a legitimate tactic. This, in many ways, was the first age of terrorism.
What about assassination attempts that didn't succeed?
Yes, we shouldn't forget that there were many attempted, including attempts on the life of Queen Victoria. But let's take a couple of examples. One comes from the Ottoman Empire. On the 21st of July, 1905, an attempt was made to kill Sultan Abdul Hamid in a car bombing outside a mosque in Istanbul. In this case, the group responsible was the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. So in this case, it was nationalism and attacks on the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire rather than anarchism that provided the context. However, one of the men involved and who was arrested was actually a Belgian anarchist who worked in Istanbul and had joined that Armenian group. By the way, the emperor, whose procession had been delayed, was unharmed, yet there was a certain history of assassination throughout the history of the Ottoman dynasty. And another example comes from just the year afterwards in Spain, when there was an attempt to assassinate King Alfonso XIII of Spain on the day of his wedding to one of Queen Victoria's granddaughters. There were casualties, and her wedding dress was splattered with blood, but the royal couple survived. But Cindy, in the late 1800s, wasn't there also an attempt to assassinate a royal in Australia, in Sydney?
In this case, we're talking about Prince Alfred, the second son of Britain's Queen Victoria, who in March 1868 was midway through what was Britain's first global royal tour, and he was visiting the Australian colonies, which at that point were colonies of the British Empire. At a picnic on the shores of Sydney Harbour, which was held to raise funds for a new sailors' home in Sydney, and Alfred, as a career naval officer, was seen as an appropriate guest for such a fundraising event. Alfred was shot in the back by one Henry James O'Farrell. Now, O'Farrell was an Australian of Irish background who felt that he was acting on behalf of the Fenians, an Irish nationalist organisation that sought to restore independence to Ireland from British rule. O'Farrell shot Alfred in the back with 2 pistols. Alfred was wounded and was taken away, where he luckily was operated on a few days later and made a quick and full recovery. But not so the colony. The population and the colonial government in Sydney was absolutely appalled that an attempt to assassinate Queen Victoria's son took place on their land. And this led to all kinds of anger and recrimination, not just against O'Farrell, but sadly for other Australians of Irish background. Now, the Queen and the British government pleaded for clemency, but the colonial government in Sydney wanted to make an example of O'Farrell, and he was tried, convicted, and then hung at Darlinghurst Jail a mere 6 weeks after the shooting. But there was a silver lining to this assassination attempt. 2 hospitals, which were then being planned, one in Melbourne, one in Sydney, received a huge boost to their subscription efforts by colonists who were determined to show the world that they were, in fact, loyal subjects of Queen Victoria and the Empire. And so today we have the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne and the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney, both, if you like, testament to the loyalty of British colonists in Australia in the 1860s. But I think we also might thank Henry James O'Farrell for getting the ball rolling. Now, Robert, what about royal assassinations outside of Europe itself?
One case we can return to the ill-fated Habsburg royal family. To simplify the story, in the 1860s, and this may sound quite strange, the French and the Austrians decided to establish what would effectively be a puppet kingdom in Mexico, which had had a republic. They were aiming to gain political influence and commercial profits in the Americas. The man chosen for the job was Archduke Maximilian I. He was the youngest brother of Emperor Franz Joseph, which, as you'll remember, was the husband of Sissi. So he and his wife Charlotte, who was a Belgian princess, were installed in power as Emperor and Empress of Mexico, no less, by invading French troops.
What did the Mexicans think of their new emperor?
There was some support from Mexican conservatives who liked the former Republican government, which was considered too liberal, too progressive. But most Mexicans didn't want a monarchy, and they didn't like the new imperial couple. And for their part, Maximilian and Charlotte didn't much like Mexico either. They thought of it as rather backward. They even imported vast quantities of silver and crystal and other such luxury items from Europe so that they could continue to lead the royal lifestyle to which they had been accustomed. They remained on the throne for about 3 years, but opposition steadily mounted. Finally, there was an insurrection, the monarchy was overturned, and Maximilian was executed by a firing squad on the order of the victorious rebels. Empress Charlotte, or Carlotta as she was also called, went mad, or at least that's the phrase used at the time, and she returned to Belgium and suffered from depression and spent the rest of her life in seclusion.
But hang on, Robert. Isn't the case of Maximilian really one of execution, not assassination?
That's a good point, but perhaps this shows how one event can be viewed from different perspectives depending on political allegiance. For Maximilian's family, his killing was, of course, a case of murder or assassination of the most heinous sort. For his opponents, the execution was justified by the invasion, by the setting up of a monarchy, and by his dereliction of duty and his responsibilities to the Mexican people.
And indeed, that is sometimes the case in other times and places, isn't it?
Think of Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette. For the French revolutionaries, sending them to the guillotine was just punishment for treason after a trial in Parliament. For monarchists in France, it was a kind of assassination or even murder. And monarchists in France still hold a memorial mass for the repose of the king's and queen's souls each January. Well, think about Russia. The Bolsheviks killed the Romanov royals, the Tsar and the Tsarina, and their children, to keep them from trying to return to power after the communist revolution of 1917. However, in the post-Soviet era, the remains of the Tsar and his family were disinterred and reburied with great pomp in a cathedral. And in fact, Nicholas and Alexandra have been made saints in the Russian Orthodox Church. So there's a posthumous history of these assassinated monarchs as well. Cindy, we've talked about royal assassinations at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s. Did these continue?
Indeed, they did. For instance, the Yugoslav king Alexander I was assassinated in Marseille in the south of France in 1934. But there were also a number of assassinations elsewhere. The Shah of Afghanistan, the king of Jordan, the king of Iraq, the king of Saudi Arabia. And in perhaps the most recent and dramatic incident, the king and queen of Nepal and 9 other royals were shot dead by none other than the heir to the throne of that country in 2001. Apparently, the royal family was opposed to his plans for marriage.
Did dynasties survive assassinations?
Many did, but assassinations directly or indirectly weakened other dynasties. The assassination of the king and crown prince of Portugal in 1908, for example, left as heir a young and experienced heir at a time when republicanism was on the rise. 2 years later, there was a peaceful revolution that established a republic in Portugal. The king and his family were unharmed, and they fled into exile. And in the case of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, some historians point to a link between his assassination in 1914 and the end of the Habsburg dynasty at the end of the First World War. But the monarchy in Nepal never recovered, and the last king was forced to abdicate in 2008. Now, Robert, what about monarchs today? Are they safe?
Security and surveillance are much more intense nowadays than they were a century ago. Royals, or at least the senior ones, are surrounded by large security details. They often travel in armored vehicles. But even such high levels of protection cannot guarantee that any public person, whether a royal, a president, or any other celebrity, will be safe from harm. They're deranged individuals, political rebels, and other potential assassins who may lurk in the shadows. So looking back on the history of royal assassinations and attempts, perhaps many heads that wear crowns do not rest easy. Thank you for joining us for this podcast, and please listen to the next one when our subject will be colonialism.
This series of podcasts has been created by the Modern Monarchy and Global Perspective Research Hub at the University of Sydney. Please see our website for further information at global-modern-monarchy.sydney.edu.au. The texts of the podcasts were written by Associate Professor Cindy McCreary and Professor Emeritus Robert Aldrich, and the series was produced by Peter Adams from the University of Sydney School of Humanities. The podcasts are copyright by the University of Sydney, and the authors and interviewees retain rights to their material. We acknowledge the Indigenous Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which the University of Sydney stands.